queremos introducir la sesión. Va a introducir primero, comenzar Ian, luego John y finalmente va a haber un pequeño espacio para preguntas y respuestas al final de la sesión, como hemos venido haciendo durante estos 2 días. Así que no tengo nada más para decir y John, es your.
Buen día. Me encanta estar aquí para Focal 5 y visitar Argentina para la primera vez. Quiero felicitar a César y su equipo para una excelente conferencia y muchas gracias para el Keynote Show anoche. Era muy agradable. Como escucháis, no hablo muy bien el español. Lo siento, entonces voy a hacer la presentación en inglés, aunque tengo las láminas en español. Discúlpeme. So I switch into English now. So thank you very much for inviting me to speak. What we're going to do is, as Alejandro said in the introduction, is to talk both about the strategy but also about the current work programme and some of the key projects in there, because as you'll see, we have some very big projects on the programme at the moment, and they will be with us for a number of years going forwards. So it seems right to actually talk about those. So I'll hand over to John in a minute, who will talk about the current projects, and then I will come back and talk about the strategy and the work plan consultation, and some of the things that you, the members of FOCAL, have been saying to us. And I have to say we were absolutely delighted that we had responses to the strategy and work plan from, I think, 11 countries in Latin America, which is absolutely the first time we've had that, and some very good comments and very thoughtful comments that we've received. So just to remind you what's actually happened in the last year since I spoke in Panama, and it has been a very busy year, and certainly we appreciate the support that we've had from our stakeholders in terms of responding to all of these consultations and final documents that we put out. In particular, I would like to highlight the responses to the consultation paper on heritage, and we received a consolidated response from FOCAL, so we were very pleased to receive that, and we had some very good and very precise feedback in that, so that's very helpful, and that will help us as we take that forward. We also have consulted on our approach to revenue and non-exchange expenditure. That's very active at the moment. As I said, I'll come back and talk about the strategy and work plan. So all of those were initial stage consultation documents. Then we had 3 exposure drafts, so firmer proposals on how to account for financial instruments, social benefits, and also leases. And the financial instruments proposals have now been finalised in IPSASB 41 that was issued in August. John will talk about that. And we also issued a final, the update on the cash basis IPSAS. Happily not relevant, as we heard, in many countries in Latin America, in fact most, I think. And I will, in the second half, actually show you some data that we have in terms of the progress with adoption of accrual in Latin America and more broadly around the world. So that's the list of products, outputs, if you like, since the last meeting. Now, you know, I recognise, and we'll talk about this when we get to the strategy and work plan consultation, that number of outputs and volume of outputs is not necessarily a good measure of the board's activities. It also poses challenges for you as users of the standards, and we recognise that, and we'll come on to that when we talk about the strategy and the work plan. Just to very briefly remind you, those are the list of projects that we have on the active work programme at the moment. Most of those featured in that slide that I just showed you in terms of outputs. What we are trying to do is balance developing the suite of public sector specific standards, but also maintaining the links with IFRS. And I think particularly when we talk about accounting for SOEs and some of the challenges in terms of consolidating SOEs that are coming up in Latin America, that is very important. Just in terms of the programme, as John will mention, I would just highlight the project at the top there, social benefits, which I know is more or less relevant in many jurisdictions. In some it's extremely important, in others less so. But that's a project that's been around on the IPSASB's work programme since 2002. And we now, as a result of the comments we received, expect to finalise that standard at the end of the year. But then those other projects actually will go through into 2019, 2020 and 2021 even in one or two cases. So that shows you that we have quite a considerable work programme at the moment that will influence what we can take on in terms of the strategy and work plan. I will come back shortly and talk about that, but before that, John is just going to give you an update then on the key projects at the moment.
Buenos días a todos. Muchas gracias por la invitación a Focal 5. Como Ian, soy encantado de estar en Buenos Aires, magnífica ciudad y diversa. Gracias particularmente a César y las organizaciones internacionales. Perdón, voy a continuar en inglés. Right, Ian mentioned social benefits, and this is probably our most important project. It's the most glaring omission in our literature. And in the past, people have said to us, well, why should we adopt your standards when one of the most, if not the most significant expenditure item of governments and public sector entities, you don't have a standard? It's not for the want of trying. We first did work on social benefits in 2002. So we've been going 15 years with a hiatus for our conceptual framework, and hopefully we're in a position where soon we will finalize the work. I showed this slide, I think, last year in Panama, and what that does is show the 5 recognition points under what we call the obligating event approach for social benefits, which we put forward in the consultation paper. And the further to the left in that diagram you go, the larger the liability that would be recognized on balance sheet and the larger the initial expense. And when we developed an exposure draft of a pronouncement, we refined this approach a little bit. We simplified it because some of our constituents said, you're making a complex topic even more complex. And we refined it to one particular recognition point on that slide, criteria for eligibility for the next payment. Okay? And we also added being alive. Now, that is quite a narrow approach to the recognition of expenses and liabilities. It's one that a large number of our members support, but not all of them. It's impossible to get a consensus in this area, and I think probably we've tried too much to do so in the past. This is the approach that generally preparers favour, simply because it's not going to lead to a large expense and liability. Some other members of the community, some users, for instance, suggest that we should be recognising a larger expense and liability. And that view is reflected in the pink oval on that slide. And when we issued an ED, we had an alternative view, which 3 of our members signed up to. And what that alternative view basically said was that having a single recognition point for all programs was inappropriate, and there are certain programs where a more expansive, a larger liability and expense might be appropriate. either what we call key participatory events or threshold eligibility criteria. Once that an individual has satisfied the original eligibility criteria for a social benefit, then you should carry out an actuarial measurement of a liability. So that was reflected, as I say, in the alternative view in Exposure Draft 63. The most important issues are the issues that we've looked at over the last 2 or 3 board meetings. And the board's come to some quite important decisions. Firstly, the board has confirmed with some minor modifications the approach to recognition and measurement in ED 63. That single eligibility, meeting of eligibility criteria, and an expense and liability which will be a maximum of the next instalment, the next payment. For a minority of programs, we've also given an option to use what we call the insurance approach. Now, this is where a social program has the characteristics of an insurance scheme and is managed like an insurance scheme and is fully funded. Some of the respondents to the ED said that if those criteria were met, then use of the insurance approach, which will rely on IFRS 17, the commercial standard, the ISB's standard on insurance accounting, we should make that mandatory. The board, however, decided to keep this optional, and it's probably only going to be relevant in a minority of jurisdictions. The scope and definitions are broadly going to be the same as in the ED. Importantly, the definition will be limited to cash transfers. So this pronouncement's not going to be dealing with important areas like healthcare, education, defence, street lighting. They're being dealt with in a separate project on non-exchange expenses. And the board's view is that governments and public sector entities don't have a present obligation and therefore a liability for healthcare, education, defence, street lighting prior to the delivery of those services. And we're hopeful of also completing an exposure draft on this topic in December. Board considered whether, in light of the approach to recognition and measurement, we should mandate reporting on long-term fiscal sustainability. The board continues to be of the view that long-term fiscal sustainability reporting is immensely important, but the board decided not to make such reporting mandatory and also will not at the moment carry out any further work beyond that which resulted in a practice guideline 3 to 4 years ago. We will probably carry out a post-implementation review of the pronouncement, although that will be in the context of a more general approach to post-implementation reviews that we'll be considering in light of the strategy and work plan consultation Ian will be talking about. And as I've said, we had some key decisions in June. We'll build on those at the meeting we're going to have next week, and we're quite confident that we'll be able to approve a pronouncement finally on social benefits 15 to 16 years after we first started in December of this year. Another important project that we have at the moment is revenue. And there are a number of streams to this project. The distinction between exchange and non-exchange transactions has been crucial for IPSASB, and it's underpinned much of our work. For instance, we, in our preface to our framework, talk about the fact that there are a large number of non-exchange transactions in the public sector, and that's a key characteristic of the public sector. Preparers, however, have said to us, well, this distinction, these definitions of exchange and non-exchange transactions, they're all very well in theory, but we find them quite difficult to actually operate in practice. We don't always find it easy to distinguish an exchange and non-exchange transaction. So, prompted by the work the IASB has done, which resulted in IFRS 15, we've looked at alternative approaches, and the main alternative approach is to consider whether transaction has a performance obligation, enforceable performance obligation, which requires resources to be returned to the grantor if certain requirements, if certain conditions are not met. In order to see how we could develop this approach, we distinguished classified transactions in three categories. Category A are transactions which don't have performance obligations. Now, these are some of the most significant transactions that you're going to find in the public sector. In particular, transfers between different levels of government. Often these transactions don't have conditions or performance obligations. Category C are commercial style transactions for goods and services. These are the transactions which meet the definitions in the commercial standard, IFRS 15. And the view that we took, quite an early stage, is we couldn't see any reason why these shouldn't be accounted for in an approach drawn from IFRS 15. Category B is the more interesting category of transactions. These are transactions which have performance obligations, but they're not performance obligations in accordance with the commercial standard, IFRS 15. That could be because they involve the transfer of resources to a third-party beneficiary rather than the counterparty. It could be because even though there are performance obligations, it's not clear that satisfaction of those performance obligations involves a transfer of resources. So an example of that, a specific example in the public sector, are capital grants, where we don't actually have explicit requirements. So using this framework, we've got to a certain point where the board has made some decisions. Firstly, consistent with what I previously said on category C transactions, we don't see any reason why not to replace our existing standard dealing with revenue from exchange transactions, IPSASB 9, and our existing standard dealing with construction contracts, IPSASB 11, with a standard drawn from IFRS 15. It will certainly need to be modified to reflect certain public sector practices and also public sector terminology. We want to make a very clear message that we are not seeking to delete from our literature IPSASB 23, which is our public sector specific standard on revenue from non-exchange transactions. However, IPSASB 23 is likely to be updated to address particular issues. Now, probably the most important of those are transactions with time requirements, but no other conditions. This is where, say, government makes a 5-year grant to another entity, but without a 5-year general grant, without performance obligations. And that has been a particular issue for a lot of preparers who feel that having to recognize revenue on day one presents a picture of the entity's financial performance and financial position, which is not, it can be misleading. So we're looking at ways of how we should deal with that. And we're going to apply a range of examples. In other areas, we certainly need to look at grants and other transfers, look at things like research grants, which, as I've said, involve a transfer of resources but no explicit performance obligations. We've got to decide where we're actually going to include such guidance. Will it be inside or outside the standard? On services in kind, we've decided that we're going to maintain the current approach in IPSASB 23, which will give preparers discretion as to whether or not they recognise services in kind. That can be quite a significant issue in the not-for-profit sector as well as the public sector. And we're also looking at accounting for capital grants, where we certainly need to develop some explicit guidance. Another quite large project which we have at the moment is measurement. And the reason for this measurement, for this project, really is the fact that we developed our conceptual framework with a chapter on measurement back in 2014, and many of the measurement requirements in our current literature aren't consistent with a conceptual framework. The other big driver for this is IFRS 13, fair value, which was the IASB's consolidation of guidance on fair value in the private sector. And it certainly became clear to us when we did work on financial instruments that the fair value definition in IFRS 13 is relevant for a number of public sector transactions. The other issues we're looking at in this project, we're looking at how you treat transaction costs. We're looking again at borrowing costs. Our standard on borrowing costs currently allows options for both expensing and capitalization. It's not aligned with either IAS 23, the IASB's pronouncement, which now requires capitalization, and it's not aligned either with government financial statistics, which requires expensing. We're also going to be looking more broadly at consistency with government financial statistics and valuation guidance, and consider the extent to which implementation guidance is required on certain of those measurement bases which are highlighted in the conceptual framework. We're taking a slightly different approach in this project. We're actually going to issue a consultation paper, but we're also going to include within that consultation paper a draft ED, which will give the line of travel more clearly to constituents. And the ED will be inside the consultation paper. It won't include all the detail that you'd normally expect to see in an ED, such as consequential amendments. And we'll discuss borrowing costs in the consultation paper rather than the ED. We've got projects on heritage and infrastructure, and the likelihood is that we'll be dealing with recognition of heritage assets and infrastructure assets in our current standard IPSASB 17, but we'll address certain measurement aspects in the measurement project. Ian's already mentioned the fact that we've completed a project on financial instruments. There have been two streams to our work on financial instruments: updating our literature so that it aligns with the IASB's literature, because our standards IPSASB 28 to 30 are based on IFRS literature as at the end of 2008, so they didn't reflect any of the important changes introduced by IFRS 9 financial instruments. The second strand is what you might loosely call monetary issues. These are items that may or may not meet the definition of a financial instrument. For example, monetary gold, currency in circulation, and IMF transactions, such as subscriptions and quotas. So we're looking at that in a separate strand of the project. The likelihood is we'll seek to develop application guidance rather than a new standard. And now that we've completed this work, to replace IPSAS 28 to 30, the board can focus on the public sector specific part of financial instruments. So very briefly, what does IPSAS 41, which doesn't take effect until the beginning of 2022 because we realize the importance of a long transition period, what does that standard do? Firstly, it introduces new classification and measurement requirements for both assets and liabilities. They're based both on business model, the reason for holding the financial instruments, and the cash flow configuration related to those financial instruments. One of the most important changes is the introduction of a prospective expected loss impairment model, which replaces the incurred loss model. And that, I think, was a direct response of the ISB to the 2008 financial crisis. The hedge accounting model will be much more principles-based and flexible, and much more linked to an entity's risk management practices. So it won't have the quantitative metrics that is currently in IPSAS 29. We had an ED on this, which the consultation finished at the end of last year, and we were able to approve the IPSAS in June of this year, and that was one of the relatively rare examples where we actually brought forward our timetable and approved the final pronouncement a little bit more quickly than we'd anticipated. And I'm going to finish off by saying a little bit about one of our most controversial topics, and that is leases. And I'm going to talk about the influences and the reasons why we proposed the requirements in Exposure Draft 64. Now, the board is hard at work deliberating the responses to Exposure Draft 64, and certainly when it comes to lessor accounting and the treatment of concessionary leases, there are some very diverse, very opposing views. So it is going to take us quite a bit of time to finalize this project. If we think back to Thursday, you had a full day on private-public partnerships, what we in our literature call service concession arrangements. And you had a very, very learned and thorough exposition of our standard on service concession arrangements, IPSAS 32, from Thomas Müller-Markersberger and Camila Sanchez. And the hallmark of that particular standard is that it looks at service concession arrangements from the perspective of the grantor. Now, when we started our leases project, we said, well, what are the influences? And the influences are the conceptual framework. We've got to try and ensure that what we propose is conceptually pure. What is in our literature already, notably in IPSAS 32, which, as Thomas said, adopts the control approach to assets and liabilities. And lastly, the formal due process we use when we're looking at an IFRS pronouncement and translating that into a public sector standard. Now, for leases, it was relatively straightforward. We think that the right of use model for lessee accounting, which was proposed in IFRS 16, is firstly conceptually in line with our conceptual framework. It prevents what we call arbitrage or gaming, or information symmetry. So one of the criticisms of the previous standard was that it gave entities an incentive to try and structure leasing arrangements so that they met the definition of an operating lease or a finance lease. We think that these proposals basically obviate that particular risk. It improves comparability between public sector entities that lease assets and also public sector entities that acquire assets, purchase assets. So overall, we concluded that the requirements on lessee accounting in IFRS 16 were appropriate for the public sector, and ED 64 reflected that. Things became a little bit more complicated when we looked at lessor accounting, because broadly speaking, the IASB, after considerable deliberation and consultation, decided that they were going to retain the existing lessor accounting requirements in IAS 17. And we looked at that and had concerns about it. Firstly, we didn't feel that it was consistent with our conceptual framework, because in certain cases, the lessor would not recognize the underlying asset. As I've foreshadowed, we didn't think that it was consistent with the approach that we'd taken on service concessions. And the main reason for that, as I say, is because it involves the derecognition of the underlying asset in a finance lease. It doesn't recognize the lease receivable in an operating lease. So in our view, there was an asset which was unrecognized. And we also felt that it might create consolidation issues in the public sector where the lessor and the lessee are part of the same reporting entity. Many public sector entities have a particular entity dealing with leases. So for that reason, we decided that we would depart from IFRS 16 and adopt an approach that we felt was consistent with the lessee accounting model. In other words, that right of use model for lessee accounting, we would also apply for lessor accounting. And generally speaking, in terms of accounting for the underlying asset, the lessor recognizes and measures the underlying asset in accordance with the applicable IPSASB. That's likely to be IPSASB 16 on investment property. There will be separate accounting for the lease from a right of use perspective. There's a lessor receivable that differs from IFRS 16. There's a lessee liability, which is in accordance with IFRS 16, and the transactions are measured at market cost unless it's a concessionary lease. If a lease is below market terms, our view was that the subsidy involved in that concessionary lease should be recognised on day one in much the same way as the grantor of a concessionary loan would recognise the subsidy for that loan. Now, our constituents have told us that, broadly speaking, they're content with what we're proposing on lessee accounting. However, on lessor accounting, there, as I've said, considerable mixture of views. Some constituents have agreed that what we're doing is conceptually pure and quite logical in conceptual terms and in terms of the relationship with lessee accounting. Others have said that they don't think our arguments for departing from the private sector model in IFRS 16 are sufficiently convincing. When we look at concessionary leases, some have contested the analogy that we've drawn between concessionary loans and concessionary leases and questioned why concessionary leases should be dealt in the same way as concessionary loans. They've also said more practically that affecting the proposals on concessionary leases as proposed in ED 64 is quite complex and practically difficult. So at our next meeting, we're going to be reviewing the responses in detail. That's next week. And in December, we're probably going to be look at the options for taking the lessor accounting side of this project forward. Okay. That probably means that we will not complete this project as quickly as we'd initially hoped when we started out with what we felt was a relatively straightforward convergence project with IFRS. Okay, I'm going to hand back to Ian, and Ian will take you through the strategy and work plan.
Thanks, John. So, with everything that John's just said, you could say, well, actually, why are we consulting on the work plan and the strategy going forwards? And I think really the answer to the why are we actually consulting is we need to make sure that actually what we're doing is relevant to you as users of our standards. And I think, you know, we did the first full public consultation on the work plan back in 2014. As you'll see in a few moments, actually there's a tremendous amount of work going on both adoption and implementation, and we heard about a lot of that yesterday. So it seemed right to us to actually check in and say, well, firstly, are we headed in the right direction with the existing plans? And then what more should we add to our work programme? So, document that you'll recognise. As I said, many of you have actually responded to that. We were extremely pleased that we got 11 formal responses, or responses from 11 countries to that. That was the first time we'd had that number of responses from Latin America. And I think that really shows the interest in our work, and we really appreciate you taking the time to respond to that. The key was, what should our overall strategic objective be? And in 2014, there was some controversy about us linking our standards programme to strengthening PFM. Was that something that would fetter our work as an independent standards board? Our view at the time was absolutely not. And so therefore, we made a few refinements to the overall objective, but didn't propose any changes. And I think when I listened to the sessions that were given yesterday, the fascinating sessions about how you were using the budgetary information, and the session from Brazil, for example, on the impact that the better information is having on the way you approach financial management issues, it feels absolutely right, and indeed that's what people have told us. We've also this time more explicitly linked our work to public interest and to our governance framework, and that is a difference to last time round. We have both the Public Interest Committee and the Consultative Advisory Group. The Public Interest Committee is there to make sure that we adhere to our due process requirements as a board, and to look at how we've actually evaluated the feedback and used the feedback that we receive from you, our constituents. So that is very important. But also our Consultative Advisory Group, and I'd like to acknowledge Thomas Müller-Marquez-Berger, who is the chairman of our Consultative Advisory Group. They are giving us very good strategic advice on our projects as we're working on them. And for example, we have a representative from Chile on that group. We're looking for more representation from Latin America at the moment to make sure that we're getting that input into our projects. Overall, what we're proposing is that we focus our work as a standard setter in 3 overall areas, which I'll talk about in a minute, but also that we're sharper and more focused about what we do in the area of supporting or promoting IPSASB adoption, and also working with international organisations on the use of accrual information for public financial management. So I'll just talk a little bit about those. Just to remind you, we had the 5 themes. Theme A, public sector specific projects. Theme B, convergence or alignment, as we're starting to talk about in terms of the IFRS's, the private sector standards. And then theme C, where we didn't propose projects, but thinking about the broader use of financial information, communication to stakeholders. And then 2 themes, promotion of IPSASB and also the broader use of the information. Now, one of the features that distinguished this consultation was that it wasn't just a consultation where we put something on the website and expect comments back from you. We actually took a much more active approach, and we held 4 regional roundtables with constituents around the world. So you'll see that we held them in Europe, Asia, Africa, and importantly in Latin America. And in each of those cases, that was in partnership with the regional organisation in the area. And I'd particularly like to thank Brazil in terms of the Treasury and the groups there for actually facilitating that roundtable. Really pleased with that, and we had, I think, 6 countries represented there. Leonardo, who is the board member from Brazil, played a key role in that, as did Araceli, who unfortunately isn't with us at this point in time. And as you can see, we had 384 attendees at those roundtables from over 100 different countries. And I think that's really important, because rather than synthesize the responses as you had to in terms of the written responses, we actually got individual responses from all of those people telling us what they thought, whether they agreed, partially agreed, disagreed with our work. And we're analysing that at the moment, and the board will consider those next week. So a flavour of what was actually said in terms of, did people agree with our overall strategic objective? Yes, 94% of people agreed with that. Really important, I think, those levels of agreement in terms of the legitimacy of the strategy going forwards. What about the 5 strategic themes? Well, again, very high levels of agreement with those. So, again, very important that we've got that support. Now then, when we look at what should we actually do under those themes, that's where you start to get more interesting responses, more diverse responses. So just reminding you, in terms of theme A, the public sector specific projects, we proposed 4 projects there. Interestingly, people said to us, look, you've got a very challenging work programme at the moment. Should you be adding too many more projects to that? And I think that responds as well to some of the feedback that you countries in Latin America were giving us, which is, look, we're working very hard in terms of adopting your standards. Don't keep moving the goalposts. Think very carefully about the projects that you take on going forwards. Certainly, we got strong support for a project on natural resources. We know we would have to scope that very carefully, but that certainly got a lot of support, as did, interestingly, the limited scope revision of our conceptual framework. We proposed that we needed to remove some of the uncertainties arising from changes that the ISB has made recently, and with consolidations and so on, that we needed to be really clear on those concepts where there is a direct read across to the public sector. So we got support for those. But then others, discount rates and differential reporting, people said, well, no, that's not important for us. Interestingly, we got certainly support for looking further at tax expenditures. That came through very strongly as a flavour from Latin America. And so what we're proposing is that we will only add, and the board will need to debate this next week, but the proposal to the board is we only add those 2 projects, but that we start to do research on other areas, working with national standard setters to draw in their experience, because we have proposed that as those other projects are completed, we will come back to you and say, now they're completed, what are your priorities in terms of new projects? And we'll do that around about 2020-21, so that what we do is we would have much better scoped projects for you to give your views on at that stage. The second theme was working with IFRS. Certainly strong steer to think very carefully there about our relationship with ISB. Now that we're maturing as a standard setter, how do we work with them? We proposed that we should review one of our older standards, the one on segmental reporting there. Stakeholders have said to us, well, no, actually that's not really where we see the priorities. Certainly some from Latin America and elsewhere in the world said, you need to think about financial statements. What should be in financial statements? That's more important to us. So I think we will be looking at that. Also, other themes coming through from Latin America, strong support for us to do something, for example, on costing. Now, we have a problem as far as issuing a standard on that, because that would be outside our remit. But we do think, and I think the presentation yesterday showed how important this is and what useful information can be provided. So what we're looking at there is there is some best practice guidance that's already come out from IFAC a few years ago. Can we get that put onto the website? Can we also actually put some case study material onto the website as well? So that's the sort of way that we're thinking about moving on that. And theme C, certainly people want us to do some work in that area, but they agreed broadly that there are other priorities at the moment. So then I'll move on to the other areas and introduce some current work. Now, I hesitate in introducing this because I know people have very strong views about where they are in the process, firstly of adopting the standards and then implementing the standards. Now, IFAC, working with the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accountancy, have been trying to actually get some definitive data on this from around the world. And where we are at the moment is we have data from 150 countries. We've tried to take a very hard view on this in terms of saying we really require evidence for countries being on accrual. And in particular, we want to see, if possible, financial statements. So in terms of saying which countries are on accrual at the moment, we're aware that, for example, Colombia and Chile are in their implementation year. We've allocated them to cash transitioning to accrual at the moment. Next year, we would hope that with those financial statements being issued, and we will keep these data up to date, that you would move into the accrual category. So we have a very tough definition of being on accrual at the moment. And that's what we think the world map looks like at the moment. We're still completing the verification work, but the light blue is those countries on accrual at the moment. Cash transitioning to accrual is the category to look at, the 45% there. It's very broad. It includes some jurisdictions that are well on the way to accrual adoption, as I've mentioned, and Malaysia is another example of a country in its transition year to accrual at the moment. A lot still on cash. What we expect, we've done some working forward based on what we know. We think that picture will change dramatically over the next 5 years. So if I show you the next map, that's what we expect the picture to be by 2023. So a change from 25% on accrual reporting to 65%. And I think, listening to what was being said yesterday, tremendous amount of work going on around the world. But that really challenges us as well to be relevant and to listen to what you are saying and what you are doing, the issues that you are finding in practice. And the real question for us is, given the resources that we have, how do we actually do that? And we talked about that in the strategy. We tried, and this is a very highly simplified diagram, but what it's trying to do is actually say there are a lot of different players in terms of supporting implementation. It's not just the resources that you, the governments, put in, it's the resources that the regional international organisations put in. It's firms, consultants and so on. We are a player in that, but we are only part of that picture. So we need to be sharper in terms of what we do. We need to improve the material we provide you with in terms of implementing our new standards. But then what do we do in terms of working with you, working with those other players? And we think that those roundtables could be a very powerful way of actually keeping the communication going. Certainly in Africa, we now have a very good relationship with the African Union, who are our partner there. They've become an observer on the IPSASB board, and we're proposing a further event with them next year. So a day where we would meet and discuss our current projects and really get direct input into those. And we think that might be an approach that might be worth exploring in Latin America as well. So that's something that I leave you with as a thought. But that direct discussion seems to have gone extremely well with our stakeholders. Finally, then, how do we work with other organisations to promote the use of accrual more broadly? And I think this is particularly about our relationship with the regional international organisations who are tremendously persuasive in terms of the guidance that they put out. IMF, for example, will be putting out a publication later on this autumn on use of accrual in their fiscal monitor. And so we will be having another event in March when our meeting is in Washington, and we hope to be talking to the international organisations, and Ziamara and I will be talking about how we take that forward immediately after this session. So we're fairly well through the process. We expect to finalise the strategy and work plan at our December meeting. That will be drawing on what you've said. We will have a very active discussion, I think, next week in the board. Further input from our oversight, from our Public Interest Committee and our Consultative Advisory Group during September and October, prior to approval in December. And then developing the project's going to be very important to get input from that. And just the third bullet in 2019, just an advert for the third Public Sector Standard Setters Forum that we will hold in Canada. If possible, we would like input from jurisdictions from Latin America, because we will be talking about those future projects, both the definite ones and those that we're researching, wanting to get your ideas and your input into those. And that's really where we are expecting to go in the future. Thank you very much for listening. Both John and I are very happy to take your questions, but I would just say, remembering back to when I stood here talking to you in Panama last year, it has been fantastic, the input that we have had from you over the last year. We really appreciate that. It's going to be very important in terms of our deliberations next week. So please do keep responding to us. So thank you very much.
Bueno, vamos, después de la exposición de John Stanford y de la de Ian Carruthers, vamos a abrir un espacio de unos minutos para preguntas. Seguimos la modalidad de ayer, ¿verdad? Si ustedes tuvieran alguna pregunta, por favor, escríbanla, se la entregan a las personas de la organización y nosotros la transmitimos.
Bueno, mientras viene la gente de la organización para recoger las preguntas, me permito y pido permiso para hacer una, porque es un poquito larga en cuanto a la explicación. Nosotros estamos ingresando o tratamos de ingresar en la OCDE. Uno de los requisitos que nos piden a las empresas es que estén alineadas a las normas de información financiera. El problema que nos encontramos en algunos aspectos es que el Estado o la Administración Central tiene tres formas de aportar fondos a una empresa pública. Dándole un préstamo, claramente es un pasivo para la empresa que lo recibe, haciendo un aporte de capital que claramente va al patrimonio, pero también hay gastos sin contraprestación, haciendo una transferencia. Para nuestra definición, la transferencia es un subsidio, es un regalo. Entonces, si es un regalo, la primera cuestión es que cuando se trata de bienes de capital, porque si es para gastos corrientes, el déficit queda enjuagado, pero si va para gasto de capital, esto tiene que ser reflejado como un ingreso no propio de la actividad. Este ingreso genera un impuesto a las ganancias. Y en la Argentina, el impuesto a las ganancias es coparticipable con las provincias. Con lo cual, si cumplimos estrictamente la ley, el querer financiar una empresa pública, una empresa de su propiedad por parte del Estado, estaría generando una distribución de impuestos hacia todas las provincias. En el marco privado, todo aporte que hace el dueño o toda transferencia que hace, aporte de dinero que hace el dueño, si no está específicamente aclarado que es un préstamo, es un aporte de capital. Pero en el Estado nos encontramos que si lo reflejan en el pasivo o en el patrimonio estarían distorsionando el marco contable que dice, no, presupuestariamente usted tiene un aporte de capital o tiene una transferencia. Entonces, las empresas se encuentran en ese problema. Si lo mandan como utilidad, tienen que pagar un impuesto y no le alcanza para comprar el bien. Y si lo mandan al patrimonio neto, están distorsionando un poco el objetivo, o mejor dicho, la indicación presupuestaria de tener digamos que considerarlo como un ingreso. Primeramente, una opinión por parte del panel. Y segundo, un breve comentario. Cuando se hizo todo el marco de lo que se van a trabajar, los bienes naturales, se dejó como en un segundo los bienes intangibles. Y sin embargo, cuando consideramos los bienes naturales, creo que los intangibles también forman parte de esos bienes naturales. Así que, bueno, gracias y perdón por la pregunta no escrita en papel.
So thank you, Cesar. I mean, I think, you know, what you've shown is the complexity of transactions within the public sector. And I think, you know, you've given us examples of the challenges faced in Argentina, and we know that there are a lot of challenges around the world. I think the challenge that we face is to try and portray the economic substance of the transaction in accounting terms and in economic terms in a way that makes sense and give good data for decision making. The challenge, and I know this from my own experience in my own jurisdiction as a standard setter, for example, for local government, is that you have this difficulty between regulation, in the example you gave, taxation, and accounting principles. And what we're trying to do is actually set principles for the consistent treatment around the world of transactions. As John said, in terms of transfers, we're aware that we need to give more guidance on those areas. We're also trying to give guidance on, for example, the application in certain areas. So, for example, the issue came up of state-owned enterprises in Latin America. It's a big issue in terms of consolidation so we've tried to give some guidance on that. But I think, you know, we do have a problem with not being able to give specific guidance for individual jurisdictions. But I think what we're trying to do is sort of be as responsive to people's issues as possible. We're aware that this area around transfers is particularly tricky, so that's why we're trying to concentrate on that and to clarify for stakeholders as much as possible. Also, as we are also thinking, as a result of what's been said, how do we pick up from people on problems that have emerged in terms of implementation of the standards? And we think we need to be much better on that. We do have mechanisms for addressing issues through our annual improvements and so on. So what we want to do as well is actually be more responsive when people actually raise something that's a general issue, that we can actually fix that quicker and help people. Clearly then there are specifics that need to be worked through in a jurisdiction in terms of the incentives and the relationships between the federal government, the central government and state-owned enterprises, and there may be some issues that crop up in terms of the interface between accounting and taxation. But what we want to do is provide you with as clear as possible guidance on the principles. Now, you referred to the project on natural resources. I think that's a good example of something where we're conscious that one of the key issues for going forwards in getting good focused standards will actually be to research more thoroughly before we really start detailed standard setting work. And I know on that natural resources issue, you're right, people have raised the issue about intangibles. Should those be included? There's also the question of where should the dividing line be, because, for example, people might think about water and things like that. Should that be included or not? So I think we're going to have to, it is a really important issue around the world. People want us to do work in this, but I think we have to be very careful in terms of how we define what natural resources are in order to provide useful information, and to sort of help people with managing
the reserves that they do have and things like that. So I think we will need to be very clear on that. It may be that we might split that up into several stages as a project in order to progress guidance more quickly on key issues. So, you know, I think your point is well made, and that's certainly what we plan to do. For example, with the Public Sector Standard Setters Forum I referred to next June, that will be a discussion with standard setters about what should be the scope of that project and how should we take it forward.
Bueno, ¿tenemos alguna otra pregunta? Pareciera que no hay más preguntas, entonces vamos a agradecer a Ian y a John por sus exposiciones, y le damos la palabra a César para la próxima sesión. Gracias.
Bueno.